وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So before we had talked about actually doing actions for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this chapter he's going to spend time talking about those actions and talking about those deeds and avoiding them and staying away from them out of fear. And this is something that is it's the flip side of riyā, right? So you do something for others, or you stay away from doing something for the sake of others. And he's saying that both of these are problematic. So how do I kind of develop this line, or how do I develop that threshold to make sure that I'm not falling into either of these? We spoke a lot about how do we avoid riyā, right? Like, how do we avoid doing actions for the sake of others? Now we're going to talk about how do we avoid abandoning acts for the sake of others. So he said there are people who abandon acts of worship out of fear because they feel that people might say that they're showing off. And it's important for us to keep in mind and to understand that this is something that is wrong. So if I don't do something, right? So if I don't do my 2 rakat, or if I don't pray, or if I don't fast, or if I don't do certain good deeds out of fear that people will say something about me, then this is something that he says is incorrect. And this is actually essentially what the shaitan wants, right? He wants us to abandon acts. He wants to stay away from things. He doesn't want us to do good deeds. It is those good deeds that will help get us, inshallah, into paradise. And the less that he allows us to do, the more problematic it ends up being for us. And it's actually what it is that he is seeking and what he wants. He said that there are 2 types of acts of obedience, right? Those things that don't inherently bring pleasure, and those that are pleasurable, right? Those things that you enjoy. And he mentions acts like, he mentioned things like prayer, fasting, making hajj, he making jihad. So when he says here that prayer in and of itself isn't something that's enjoyable, meaning that there are some actions that might not be enjoyable in and of themselves, but can it get to a point of enjoyment? Yeah, absolutely, right? It can get to a point where prayer is enjoyable. It can get to a point where fasting is enjoyable. But he's saying that in and of themselves, if you kind of remove them from, right? Yeah, even sometimes for us, it can feel like a chore, right? All right. There are times where we look forward to prayer. There are times where we look forward to like Ramadan and fasting. Even when it comes time to like distribute zakat and things like that. But he's saying that they're not necessarily in and of themselves things that people normally enjoy. He said there are other things like being a leader, where people actually enjoy that. People enjoy like judging between others, governing others, leading prayers, which is very interesting, reminding others, teaching, spending. And the reason for that is because what do all these things have in common? It's when we interact and when we deal with other people. These actions are very personal. Right? These are personal actions, which is why we might not find that same level of joy in it, versus these, right, where there is a level of joy because we're now dealing with others. And all of the things that he mentioned here, what is associated with them is this idea of leadership. And with leadership and with status comes respect. And a lot of times we enjoy receiving that respect, we enjoy being put in that status and being put on that pedestal. So when it comes to these bodily acts of worship, right? So when we talk about prayer, when we talk about fasting, when we talk about hajj, for example, he said there's an element of risk that's there. What is that risk? Meaning that riyā can fall into that action before I perform that action. And he's saying that it can happen at the same time. And the third possibility, something that can happen during. Meaning, so what's the difference? I keep pressing the wrong button. The difference between these two simultaneously is like the moment I begin my action, okay? And the last one is like I've already started the action while the action is going on. And he says here that if we understand that there are 3 elements that where this riyā can fall into, it's important for us to be aware of that so that we are vigilant throughout all of these different time frames. Don't think that just because I've made it to a certain point that I'm safe from riyā. What time frame has he not mentioned here? After. Why? Because it's done, right? the action's over. I can't have riyā for a past action, right? For something that's been done. I can only have either before, during, or like after I've started the action and I'm in the middle of it. As for before, he says that there are three ways, or there are different ways for us to, for that to become apparent. In the action itself, if I am seen doing that action, and I want to try to prevent myself from falling into that riyah, and he says that there are a few ways of doing that, either by dispelling this idea and making sure that I'm doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, making sure that I'm questioning myself and asking myself and reminding myself of what that intention actually looks like. And some of the things that he reminds us that we should and we can ask ourselves is asking ourselves that, are you not ashamed before your Lord? Meaning that if I'm performing this action, if I'm doing this action, I should ask myself, who am I doing this for? Why am I doing this? And if I'm doing this for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or if I'm falling into a sin, then okay, am I not like kind of shaming myself and kind of understanding where it is that I stand to remind myself not to perform that action? He also mentions, do not be generous in your deeds for the sake of people, but be generous for the sake of Allah. Again, asking, reminding myself, telling myself of why it is that I am doing these particular deeds to make sure that my intention is pure. And this essentially is taqwa, right? This idea of questioning, this idea of mujahada, this idea of fighting against myself, purifying my intention, making sure that I'm doing things for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And it is in that where he mentions here that this is where you actually find qana'ah, right? This is where you're going to find tranquility. The moment that I remember and I align myself and I bring myself back to the state of reminding myself of why it is that I'm doing or performing certain actions, this is a way for me to purify my heart, and it is a way for me to purify my deeds. The second place that he mentions is simultaneously, like, right? So the moment I start my action, I can have this doubt enter my heart that I want to do it for someone else or for the sake of someone else. And he says that I have a choice, right? The moment that that idea happens, what can I do now to the action? He's like, you can abandon it, right? I can leave the action off altogether, or I can repel it, huh?
Can you refresh your niyyah or?
So over here, when he talks about repel, what does that mean? Right, you're actually pushing away the thought, right? You're trying to actively push that thought away. He's saying these are the only two ways to functionally deal with it. Ideally, what should I do? What do you guys think? If I'm getting ready to pray, and I see somebody, and I'm like, man, I want them to watch me pray and think that I'm righteous and pious. Right? And I'm about to start praying. He's saying, either I can what? I cannot pray. You can be like, you know what? Let me not do this because this person's here. Or I can fight that thought. What do you think would be better? Fighting the thought, right? Like pushing that thought away, reminding ourselves. I'm sorry?
And that missing the prayer.
Right, and this goes back to the beginning of the chapter, right? What he talks about is like, this leads to its own set of problems. Is this a reasonable strategy every single time? Right? It's not reasonable to abandon every time I fear that I'm going to fall into riyah, then I don't do it. It can get to a point of waswasa, absolutely. And that's what he says, right? He says that it's better to repel that thought and to purify our intention. Like so he says here that while an individual is praying, for example, and let's use prayer as an example because it's usually the easiest one, he starts getting these whispers, right, in the middle of that prayer. And what happens during prayer or do any good deed, what happens to my intention? It wavers. And that wavering, it is actually a sign of our sincerity. Why? So while I'm praying, my intention is starting to waver, knowing that there are other people around. And I feel like I'm sincere, and then sometimes I feel like I'm doing it for other people, and I kind of have this back and forth going on. Ghazali says that this is a sign of sincerity. Why? How can you say that?
Because you're fighting.
Right, because you're constantly struggling. If it wasn't a sign of sincerity, what would happen immediately after I got these whispers? Right, I would just, it would just fall into the gap.
Basically, you acknowledge that it's happened, which
Right,
is a good sign.
and the fact that I'm acknowledging it, this is a great sign. And the idea is to eventually get to a space and get to a place where I am sincere again. And it's not easy, right? This is something that is a challenge, which is why it's called mujahada, right? Which is why it's called a struggle, because we're constantly going back and forth with each other. We're constantly making these efforts to try to purify our intentions. So he says, when it comes to abandoning actions, eventually this gets to a point where I can abandon an action altogether, and because of my abandonment, that in itself becomes a riyah. I've stopped praying because I don't want people to say this about me. Or I've stopped fasting because I want, all my extra fast that I did because I don't want people to say this about me or assume things about me. And this dissuades a person from doing any deeds at all, right? It's actually an impure thought that he mentions, that he says. And this dissuades me from doing actions altogether. And I've lost the objective, right? The objective was to do deeds, right? The objective was to do good deeds. The objective was to purify ourselves, to better ourselves. And all I've done through this is I've stopped doing actions altogether. So he says, and he uses the example of like sifting wheat, that if I have a pile of wheat here, and because I'm scared that I won't be able to sift it properly, what happens? I just don't sift any at all. And what happens? I don't get any wheat. And it's the same thing here. If I don't do this with my deeds, right? If I seek knowledge, then I abandon it because I don't want people to say I'm a student of knowledge, or I don't want people to say, oh, look how pious and righteous he is. This is it in and of itself showing off. Why? Because we failed to attain that objective. And it's something, like we said, is very dangerous. And essentially, this is what the shaitan runs, right? He wants us, if he gets either of these, he succeeded. Either he succeeded in getting us to stop doing that good deed and whatever it is, or he succeeded because now this is the mindset that we've taken. Like, we're so worried about the world around us that we don't worry about ourselves. Which is an interesting conversation, because a lot of times we like saying that, right? It's like, well, I'm not worried about what other people say. When the reality is that we actually are worried about what other people do say. And I don't think that's a problem, right? We should worry about what other people say. Why? Shouldn't I just like not care? No? Yes?
Because we are the worry about the other people, because we don't, we are thinking about our view, our fame, what the people are saying about us.
Mm-hmm.
These things are thinking, that's why we are care, we're taking the action, any action.
Is that important? Should I care what other people think?
In reality, we don't care about the people, we have to care about our good deed, and because we are doing that for the sake
Sure.
of Allah.
I think that's great.
But in the reality, we are the social person. The people are, when do the something, they definitely think about the society and about the people, what the people are saying about this.
Is that bad?
Yes.
It's bad?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very.
Anybody else? Is it good or bad to worry about what other people think or say?
Sometimes
do.
I think the bad.
Okay, when is it good, when is it bad?
Because if I'm thinking about the Allah, so that don't care about the people.
Okay, like I think conceptually that's good, right? That I care about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I shouldn't worry about people. Sure, I think conceptually that's a great idea. But like I said, is it a problem to worry about what other people say or what other people think?
If it prevents you from doing something.
Right. So if it stopped me from doing something haram, I think that's great, right? I think that's that positive social reinforcement, that positive social pressure is something that's very healthy. What if it prevents me from, if I like a certain color and I know that people are not going to like that color, should I care? You don't know? I'm curious. Okay.
If it improves our relationships, if it improves cohesion, whatever.
Sure. Okay. So I would say that I think it's important to care what other people think and be aware of it. I don't think we should allow it to dictate our lives. right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is like, it's because of these interpersonal relationships that if I'm aware of what other people enjoy, it will help me interact with them better. Because if I keep doing things that people don't like, what's going to happen? And then it might not be haram, right? It might not be haram. So for example, I go to the grocery store and I'm like, okay, hey, let me buy some apples, and I take my thobe and I put my apples in here, and I go to the checkout, and did I do anything haram? No, but what's going to happen? How are people going to treat me? Right? He said crazy, right? So they're going to treat me as odd, right? They're going to treat me as strange, even though I didn't do anything haram. But if I took a bag, would anybody say anything to me? No.
Complying with
Social norms and customs. Right. Like we have to, like I said, and that example of like being aware of these things, it helps us when we deal and interact with others. The other thing we need to keep in mind, okay, maybe I'm a little bit more brave. Maybe I'm braver, maybe I care less of what people think. Does that same characteristic pass on to my children? Do they have the same level of tolerance that I do? My wife, my parents? And if I'm constantly going to places where I'm standing out, and again, I'm not doing anything haram, but I'm constantly entering spaces and I'm standing out, how does it affect them, positively or negatively? How do they feel? They might not want to go out with me, right? If I'm being overt and I'm being extra and I'm going above and beyond, right? It's not always healthy. It's not good for them either, because are they going to want to spend time with me? If they're like, oh man, every time we go out, he's going to start singing really loudly. Not haram, right? I can sing loudly. I'm not bothering anyone. But if I'm just walking down the street singing loudly, people are gonna be like, "What's?" You know what I mean? Like it's gonna be strange, right? It'll be odd. So, do we have to be aware of these social norms and customs? Yeah, we do. That is something that's important. Should we let it dictate how we live? No, not necessarily. There are certain things that aren't accepted in society that are part of our religion, right? Is it socially acceptable to just like go in a park and just pray? Right? Some people are like, what is he? He's putting his head on the ground. Like, what is going on here? Who cares? Right? There are certain things and certain boundaries that we won't accept. Certain types of clothing. At least here in the United States, in Saudi, they wear a type of abaya that's called a rasiyah. So basically, it's an abaya, but it hangs from your head, and it's like a giant gown. Do we see people wearing that here? What's going to happen if you wear it? Are you going to get a lot? You're going to get a lot of strange looks. You're going to attract a lot of unnecessary attention. But a woman walking around in hijab, it's normal, right? It's become a normal part, acceptable part of at least in Northern Virginia, where you're not going to draw too much of attention. But if I'm wearing something like that, what's going to happen? Probably going to draw a lot of attention. Again, it's important to keep social norms and customs in mind, especially if those things are not haram. Even a Bedouin man, he came into the masjid. It was Masjid Nabawi, and he looked around and he said, "Man minkum Muhammad?" He said, "Who amongst you is Muhammad?" What does that tell us? Right, he was dressed just like everyone else. He didn't dress anything there, and even Abu Lahab and Abu Jahl and like all of the pagans of Mecca. You know the complaint that they didn't have? They're like, oh, how come you changed our clothing? How come you changed the way that we spoke? Right? He didn't change any of those things. Those things actually stayed. Even the way that he greeted, even the way, like, they're like, oh, how come all of a sudden you're doing all of these strange actions? How come you're interacting with us in a different way? No. Those things were actually, they stayed. So, understanding and maintaining customs and norms, it is actually a way to bring acceptance into different spaces and places. Because if I do things people are familiar with, how does that make others feel? It makes them feel comfortable. It doesn't make it feel like this person is bringing something foreign. It doesn't make him feel like this person is bringing something different. So, I would say, like, even within our society, are there more Black American Muslims or white American Muslims? There are more Black American Muslims. Why? Somewhere along the line, in their ancestry, there were Muslims. So names, like, I've seen names like Khalid, Muhammad, Aisha. These aren't strange names within the Black American community. Why? Because that's something they inherited. So for them, coming to Islam and dealing with those names, is it something strange? No, right? It's very familiar. How come the same thing is not in white American culture? Because they don't have that, right? Most of them came from Europe. And Islam doesn't have that same presence that it did in Africa. So that familiarity isn't there. And now, if you have Islam, to a lot of people, does it look like an indigenous religion or does it look like an immigrant religion? It looks like an immigrant religion, right? It looks like, oh, that's not for us, that's for them, right? That's their religion. So even Islam, in the way that it spread, and if you look across the Muslim world, do all Muslims dress the same way? No. Do they all speak the same language? Does everybody have to speak Arabic? No. Interestingly enough, over 80% of Muslims are what? Are not Arab. Right? Over 80% of Muslims are not Arab. Which is crazy considering this language, like this religion, it started with 100% Arabs. Right? Like it's phenomenal. You just have the entire switch in acceptance. And where is it? Like, if you look at Chinese Muslim architecture, it's very different from Indian Muslim architecture. It's very different than Persian Muslim architecture, which is very different from Gulf Muslim architecture, which is very different from North African Muslim architecture, which is very different than Moroccan Muslim architecture. And even in America, you have your own unique architecture with masajid. That for us shows the cultural pervasiveness of Islam. And like, it doesn't matter what culture you'll go into, because Islam came to bring religious values. And it didn't come to destroy what? Cultural ones. The only cultural values Islam doesn't accept are what? The ones that are what? How can I say, okay, this cultural value we can't practice. Why? Because it's against the Sharia, right? It's against Islam. Everything else, it's like, okay, well, truthfulness is really important in our culture. Well, what is Islam going to say? It's like, yeah, that's great. You have to continue that. That's wonderful. Even amongst the pagan Arabs, some characteristics that they were famous for was their generosity, for their they were hospitable. In Islam, did they come like, oh no, we're not going to do it like the pagan Arabs do it. We're going to do it our way. Right? No, it was something that they were familiar with. So this idea of familiarity is something that we should not overlook. It's not something we should undermine. It's something that we should actually be very proud of, and that whatever spaces that we Muslims go into, it's okay. We're part of the culture that's there. We don't need to come with a different way. We don't need to come with a different dress. We don't need to come with a different way to speak. Because Islam, which ethnic group owns Islam? None. It's universal. This is Allah's religion. It's something He set down, knowing that it's going to go to different places and different spaces. And we'll find time and again that when there are problems, either between a husband and wife, or between a father and his children, or between co-workers, or within the community, are those religious problems or are they cultural problems? Cultural. They're more often than not cultural problems and issues. And the problem is that when people look at Islam, if we all wear glasses, right? Like all of us, we wear these glasses. Usually the first pair of glasses that we put on are the cultural ones, and then the second ones we put on are what? Then the religious ones. So now I'm looking at Islam through what? Through my cultural lens. Versus if I put my religious glasses on and then my cultural ones. It would help change the entire perspective of how we deal with each other, how we deal with our children, how we deal with our families. The number of complaints I get from some, alhamdulillah, not all, but some married couples, I wouldn't have these problems if I was back home. Right? I've heard this from a number of people. And I usually respond to them as like, yeah, you'd probably have a different set of problems. Right? Like, I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah. And the thing is like, okay, well, everything is like, there's a cost benefit that's there. And even understanding the places that we live, or even having an attachment to places that we live. If I love where I live, or I love where I was raised, why is that an issue of contention? Did the Prophet ﷺ love Mecca or not? When he was being kicked out. Now this was at the peak of the animosity and enmity toward him ﷺ. You know what he turned around and said before he was kicked out? He says, "Anti ahabba al-baqa ilayya." He said, "You are the most beloved piece of land to me. Like you are the most beloved earth to me." Like, he loved Mecca. Did he love the shirk? Did he love the prostitution? Did he love the oppression? Did he love the killing? No, obviously he didn't love those things. But we have to learn how to compartmentalize some of these things. Like, okay, there are a lot of elements that I can love about a place without loving everything about that place. And there's nothing wrong, like, in the beauty of Islam is, there's nothing wrong with love, right? Like, having love for things is great. It's actually very healthy. It's the thing that actually allows the heart to grow. Because we learn to kind of put our heart out there. It helps us increase in our vulnerability when we're dealing with each other. And I don't mean vulnerability like because it's expressed like, in different ways from different people. Men are usually more restrained than women, and that's fine. But being vulnerable can be something as simple as, I'm angry because you yelled at me. And that's it. Right? I've stated very clearly my emotion. I've stated very clearly the reason for that. And that's it. That's the solution. Some people require more expression. Some people require more involvement, more explanation, and that's fine. But we need to get to that point where we recognize that emotion, we're able to express it. And many times, because of our cultural values, and what do cultural values look like? Unfortunately, I just had a phone call today, unfortunately. But there's a couple that wants to get married. So I said, okay, hey, listen, I have to speak to your father. And she was like, my father doesn't agree. I said, I have to talk to him. I said, I have to do my due diligence. I call him up and I'm like, okay, hey, listen, your daughter came to me. She wants to get married. What's going on? Please, this is your opportunity to tell me why this shouldn't happen. He's like, oh, those are personal reasons. I was like, okay, can you share one with me? He's like, no, they're like family reasons. And I was like, so you can't share any? He was like, no. I was like, okay. It's not Islam that prevented him from speaking. It's not. It's not the religion that prevented him from speaking. Because I've been on the other end of phone calls with fathers who are like, thank you for calling. I've been trying to talk to her. This guy, he has XYZ problem. I have no problem. Tell me when I can come in so we can meet and so we can sit down and have a conversation. I'm so glad she came to you. The difference, like ego, arrogance, my family pride, my family name, where does that come from? Like those aren't Islamic values at all. It's the cultural values that we put on the pedestal. And then when it comes to Islam, because it's so easy, and subhanAllah, it's amazing, like, all of this talk about showing off and like our intention and stuff like that. If I want to destroy a relationship, all I have to do is put myself in front of it. That's it. The moment I put myself and my nafs and my ego in front of a relationship, you know what's going to happen to that relationship? It's going to get destroyed. No, I can't do this because I'm angry. I can't do, are you doing me a favor when you're angry? Right? That I should be like, oh, okay, I'm sorry, you're angry. The world should cater to you and your anger and your upset. No, that's not how that works. You have a right to ask for space. You have a right to ask for time, but that time cannot be indefinite. Like, this is how mutual respect works. And the only thing that will remind me that this person has a right is what? So my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's it. Otherwise, why maintain relationships at all? Why make efforts at all? If we understand and we know that this individual has a right over me, who gave them that right? It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I am in no position to take that right away. But what will make me feel that? Oh, well, my family honor, right? I'm the father. This is the level of respect that I live in. And subhanAllah, it's amazing that the only thing that causes me to live in an ideal world in my head, right? If I want to live in ideals and work in ideals, the only thing that pushes me there is my ego. And the thing that brings me down to reality is my humility. That's the only way I can deal with people. It's like, well, he should have said this, and they should have done that. Yeah, okay, there's a lot of things we should do, but how are you going to deal with the problem right now? How are you going to deal with the issue right now? Well, he's supposed to give me this. He's not giving it to you. What do we do? Well, he should. Okay, just keep being angry, right? Like that. There's no other solution. And why am I angry? Because I feel I am deserving, and there's no way that I can get over that. All it is ego. That's it. Right? Yeah. No. Yes. Like no. But the problem is like my way or the highway. Okay. What is the alternative? Tell me how to get to this highway. Right?
There's no highway. It's my way.
It's just my way. That's it. Like I wish. Actually, oh subhanallah. Oh man. I had this couple, oh man, may Allah guide them. They're going, terrible divorce, man, terrible divorce. He owes me this, she owes me that, she owes me this, blah, blah. I turned to her and I was like, he's not going to give it to you. He's not, he doesn't have it. And I turned to the guy and I'm like, if you're not willing to compromise, you're not going to see your child. And I said, this bickering and quarreling that you guys are doing, I was like, there's only one person who's going to get hurt, and that's going to be your child. That's it. I was like, I promise you, you guys continue like this, your child is going to get hurt. But again, I deserve, I want. And this is not a foreign culture. This is American culture. So a lot of people be like, oh, our kids are American, blah, blah. And subhanAllah, I had thought like, okay, once we're here for a couple generations, all the problems that I see in Islamic boards and Islamic organizations, I think all those immigrant problems will go away. And I forgot that this, like the firstborn and the people who are like born in the United States, they're just going to bring their own problems, right? They're going to have their own set of problems. It won't be the same as the immigrant problems, but they're still going to have those issues. They're still going to have those problems. And the problem that they share is, guess what? Ego. Allah protect us. And it's universal across cultures, right? It's universal across cultures. So back to this idea of like abandoning or staying away from things. And sometimes we do it too, right? Sometimes we'll just walk away from a relationship, right? And I think that's a very clear, easy example. That I'm fighting with someone, well, why should I invest in this? Why should I spend time on this? It's like, because that's your friend. Because that's your spouse. Because that's your daughter, right? Why would you walk away from those things? Some of these things is like, oh man, I can't stand it when my daughter whines, for example. Well, who raised her? Like the neighbors? Like who's reinforced these problems and these ideals and these issues? It's like I have as a parent. But it's really hard to blame? It's really hard to blame ourselves. It's really hard to correct our behaviors, right? We're so obsessed with correcting other people's behaviors that we fail to look at our own and our own shortcomings. But that's all it takes. All it takes is like a little bit of, a little bit of introspection. Because at the end of the day, do I have control over anybody around me? No, not at all. Like, we barely have control over ourselves, right? But at least there's some. And subhanAllah, I know this is something that I know I've tried in my life. The moment I stopped being a victim. The moment I started wanting to make change, the moment I started making an effort in bettering myself, all of my relationships got better. All of them. And even the bad ones, do you know how they got better? Because I cut them off. I'm like, man, this is toxic. Why am I maintaining this relationship? This doesn't make any sense. And the rest of the 80% of my relationships were healthy, and I was not the healthy person in them. All it takes is that change has to be here. Because if we look at like, oh, you know, well, my friends are like this, and my neighbor is like this, and my dad is like that, and you know, this is like that. I'll tell you, the only thing connecting all these people is me. Is it really the problem with all these people? These are things that we really have to think about. And again, man, like this, a lot, and it's very unfortunate, but even in American culture today, it's just the feed, like, right, you know what I mean? Like that self-feeding, like, you know, the likes and the thumbs up and like, right, it's all about me. It's like, oh, it's me time, you know, like I need to worry about me, or, you know, I need to put me first. It's like, okay, it doesn't have to be all about you. There are other people in your life too, and all of these things can move together. Sometimes, do I need to give myself priority? Absolutely, right? So if I'm in a place of financial instability and my family is reliant on me, and I've had multiple cases like this. It's like, man, I have a family overseas, they're reliant on me, blah, blah. I was like, they're your family, right? They're like, yeah. I was like, they love you. They're like, yeah. I was like, they'll understand. Right? If you're not in a position to help, guess what? Tell them. The only thing that's preventing you from telling them is your ego, because you're shy to say no. But sometimes we have to be vulnerable. And the thing is, if you're not telling them yes or no, you're leaving them hanging, and that is the worst position you could put anyone in. By not giving clarity, this is the worst position anybody can be put in. Because if I say no, what can that person do? Seek other avenues. Seek alternatives. Because now they know, it's like, okay, well, this door is closed, let me look here. But if I'm like, oh, maybe, yeah, I'm trying, blah, 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 what's going to happen? They're just going to keep waiting. Right? They're going to keep waiting. And if I say yes, alhamdulillah, right? The issue is solved. But I have to learn to be honest, and like it is our ego that stops us from being that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all humble. Ameen. So there are stages here that the shaitan will try to insert himself into our intention. The first stage is he's going to try to get us to stay away and abandon that action altogether. It's like, oh, no, you're only doing this because, you know, people are watching you, blah, 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 and because he wants you to not do that action at all, so you don't reap that reward. He says that and then if he's successful, right? So if he gets us to stop abandoning that act, what do you think happens at that point? He's saying that he diverts him from the reward. How? So let's say that. So what's going on in the mindset of the person who has abandoned the action? Like this is the one who I want to imagine.
He's questioning his intention.
Right, so I'm questioning my intention, and I'm like, okay, you know what, forget it, I'm not going to pray. What is the chain of events that happens after that?
Maybe I shouldn't pray
Right?
for the next one, or like was.
So now I'm going to start doubting myself. And when I start doubting myself, what happens to those actions?
Slippery slope.
Right? It starts to end up being the slippery slope. This is the danger of waswasa. And sometimes we get caught up in waswasa because of those whispers. Sometimes we get caught up in waswasa because we don't set deadlines for ourselves. Setting deadlines is really important. And sometimes deadlines can look like, okay, hey, if nothing happens in 3 days, this is what I'm going to do. And an example of this is sometimes, like I'm sure some of us experience this. If I want a job, right, I apply for this job, and I really wanted it, how long do I wait for them to answer? A week? I really wanted it. Maybe 2 weeks? Maybe a month, right, depending on my situation. What happens if I don't set a timeline for that? I'm going to be waiting forever. And what is the advantage of setting the timeline? So let's say I set the timeline at 2 weeks. Right.
Take action.
Right. I take action, and on the 15th day I get accepted. It happens, right? The important thing is to stick by the deadline. Why?
Maybe it could become forever, like you said. I mean, and then that will cause you
Anxiety.
Right. The anxiety, slippery slope. I think one of the most important things is when we set deadlines for ourselves, it gives us a sense of control. And on top of that, the moment I set that deadline and I follow it, guess who I begin to start trusting? I start trusting myself. I start trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because I know that when I make a deadline, I'm going to stick by it. But if I keep shifting the goalposts, essentially who am I not trusting? Essentially, I'm not trusting myself, and there might be a lack of my trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we should never, and the reason we don't put ourselves, someone might be like, okay, well, what's the deal? Like, what's the big deal if I have to wait around? Blah, blah, blah. Being stuck in that middle place, when I don't have control, the less control I have over a situation, and the less control I have over what's happening, what happens? Like, what are the harms that come with that? Or are there no harms?
Self-confidence.
I'm sorry?
Your self-confidence.
Right, your confidence starts going down. What else happens? What goes up? I think they're like very inversely purpose. Right. So your doubt goes up. Doubt, what else, what feeling is associated with doubt? Anxiety. Right? So as the control decreases, what increases? Anxiety. Is that healthy?
No.
And some people will be like, man, I'm depressed. Right? Like I don't feel well, I don't feel like doing anything. Why is that? Because their anxiety is so high. They're so anxious, they've lost so much trust in themselves, they don't even trust themselves to do anything. Right? They don't want to go out, they don't want to work out, they don't want to spend time with friends. Why? Because the anxiety is so high that they've lost trust in themselves. And it's amazing how a lot of this goes back to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding that. And this putting myself in a place where I don't know, yes or no, I'm actually oppressing myself. Right? It's a type of oppression. Anything that brings harm, and anxiety is something, is anxiety healthy? No, it's not, right? If I'm putting myself in a position where I'm actually oppressing myself, this is something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has categorically prohibited.
Self-oppression.
Yes. Example. And the example from the Quran. There, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that the angels of death come to them and they say, مَا كَانْ حَالُكُمْ. They said, what was your condition? They said, كُنَّا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. That we were weak and oppressed in the land. The angels answer them and they say, أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً. It's like, what, was Allah's land not wide and vast for you? أَن تُهَاجِرُوا فِيهِ, so that you can migrate within it? Yeah. Meaning what? That they actually put themselves in a situation where what?
They would be oppressed.
They allowed themselves to be oppressed. They allowed themselves to be victims.
Yeah, because you can always leave.
Because it's like, well, you could have just got up and left. Yeah. Like, what? Why did you allow yourself? So it's, subhanAllah, not only am I not allowed to oppress others, but I'm also not allowed to oppress myself. And if I have an option, now this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ayat go on, except for those individuals who are unable, the women, children, and those who are unable to. There's always going to be exceptions, right? But if I have the ability to remove myself from a situation, is it recommended or an obligation that I remove myself? It's an obligation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what did He do with these people? He threw them in the hellfire. That's how bad self-oppression is. That's how bad self-victimization is. Is that when I'm put in a situation where the moment I recognize and I realize, like, wait, I'm allowing myself to be hurt and I'm allowing myself to be oppressed. The moment I realize it, I'm obligated to do what now?
Get out of there.
I'm obligated to get out of there. What does that look like? It can look like in different ways, right? Like either I can go set stronger boundaries with the person who's hurting me and oppressing me, or I can remove myself physically from that situation. I can bring somebody to intercede, right? Like there are different strategies to deal with it. But the way things are is not acceptable, right? And I have to make the effort to change that, and you know what I mean? So he closes by saying that, okay, not only is doing an action for the sake of others, but abandoning actions for the sake of others is also a type of riyā, because both of them, okay, we'll end here, we'll end here inshallah. One leads to the action not being accepted, the other one leads to the action not happening at all.
Yeah.
So the result is what? Zero. In both cases the result is zero. But may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prevent us from falling into riyā of doing things and falling into the riyā of abandoning things. Inshallah, I'll see you all next week. جزاكم الله خير والله أعلم وصلى الله على خير خلق نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أستغفرك وأتوب إليك جزاكم الله خير. Yeah, can we just get some help putting the chairs away? Yeah, same. Ibrahim.